Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Valerie Utara. We are group 11 with my partner RJ Barrow. So for today's video, we'll be talking about the tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the great tragic love stories from Greek mythology. The tale of the musician Orpheus and his wife Eurydice features love, death, poetry, and the afterlife. So first of all, who is Orpheus? Orpheus was a lyrist, a player of the lyre, a singer and a poet. Thracian in origin, Orpheus is in many ways the archetype of the musician and poet in Greek mythology. He was said to live near Mount Olympus and can often be found singing there. His singing was so beautiful that wild beasts would tamely follow him, seduced by the power of his song. And Orpheus was the son of Apollo, the Greek god of music and poetry. While Eurydice in Greek mythology, Eurydice was a dryad, a nymph, a female nature spirit associated with trees who became the bride of Orpheus. So now in the next slide, my partner RJ Barrow will be going to narrate the tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice.
Orpheus and Eurydice, a tragic love story. Summary. The lyrist Orpheus fell in love with the beautiful Eurydice, only for her to die shortly after. Orpheus made a journey into Hades, the underworld, to try to bring his beloved back. His wish was granted, but on the condition that he mustn't look back at Eurydice as she followed him out of Hades, until they were both safely back in the land of the living. Orpheus couldn't resist one quick glance, and Eurydice was lost to him forever. This is the short version of the tale, but there's a bit more to it than this. Eurydice was a nymph, dryad, specifically who married Orpheus. One day, while she was out among the Thracian countryside, she was pursued by a shepherd, Aristeus, who wanted her. As she fled from him, she stood on a serpent which reared up and bit her on the leg, killing her with its venom. Orpheus grieved at the loss of the love of his life, but the one thing he had was his song, and so he went to the underworld to beg for the return of Eurydice to the land of the living. Orpheus used his lyre and his beautiful singing to charm the demons of the underworld. His singing even charmed Hades, the god of the underworld, and his wife Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. Perhaps because Hades and Persephone knew, as husband and wife, what it was like to love someone, they were moved not only by Orpheus' music but by his petition as well. They certainly agreed to his request and allowed Eurydice to return with Orpheus to the land of the living. Orpheus' song and his perilous journey into the underworld were proof of his love and devotion to Eurydice. However, Hades and Persephone imposed one condition. Orpheus was to lead the way out of the underworld, with Eurydice following behind him, but on no account was Orpheus to turn back and look at his wife until they were clear of the underworld and back in the world of living. Orpheus agreed, but as he was making his way back to the underworld, he was gripped by a terrible doubt. What if Hades and Persephone had tricked him, and he was leaving his wife behind? What if she wasn't behind him at all? Eventually, when he was not far from exiting the underworld, Orpheus couldn't resist any longer and turned back to see his wife Eurydice. He shouldn't have doubted. But in looking back, he had broken the one condition Hades and Persephone had laid down, not to glance back until they were both out of the underworld. And so he had to watch in horror and despair as Eurydice was taken back down into the underworld, all because he looked back at her. So Eurydice died a second time, this time thanks to her husband. Orpheus tried to return down into the underworld to plead with the gods again, but he found the entrance to Hades buried, this time for good. Not even his song could gain him entry.
And now this is our analysis about the tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice. The Orpheus and Eurydice myth is often slightly simplified when told, and thus it loses some of its force and meaning. Why? When he has successfully negotiated the seemingly impossible persuading the gods to bring his wife back from the dead. Does Orpheus blow it all the last moment by foolishly going against their instructions and looking back at Eurydice before they are safely back in the world of the living? It's often said that it's devotion or love that is Orpheus' downfall. He is so desperate to take one quick, bestowed a glance back at his wife as she follows him out of the underworld that he turns around and in doing so, condemns her back to death. But as the summary reveals, it's actually a far more understandable emotion that prompts Orpheus' folly, which is his doubt. Orpheus doubts whether his wife really is behind him on the return journey, and eventually this doubt eats away at him until he cannot resist turning back to check. In many ways, his doubt is well placed. The Greek gods and goddesses were not above tricking mankind, and Orpheus' determination to bring his wife back from the dead was so great that he wanted to make sure he wasn't leaving the underworld without her. After all, this is the underworld we're talking about. You can't just pop back if you've forgotten something, like the supermarket. So in the last analysis, although his love for his wife played a part, Orpheus' decision to turn and look back at his wife was born of a fear that if he did look back, his wife wouldn't be there, and if that were the case, he didn't want to return to life without her. Rather than curiosity or idle, naive, love-stricken besottedness, the main emotion driving Orpheus was fear and doubt.